The afternoon sun beat down on the quiet streets of Pine Ridge as Dr. Amara Wilson drove her navy blue sedan through the neighborhood. Classical music played softly from her speakers as she headed home after a long day of meetings. It was her first week in town, and she was still getting used to the tree-lined streets and sprawling houses of this upscale area where she'd recently purchased a home. Amara slowed as she approached a four-way stop, coming to a complete halt. She glanced in all directions, noting the empty streets, then proceeded forward. In her rearview mirror, she noticed a police cruiser that had been parked on a side street suddenly pull out behind her. The cruiser followed for about half a block before the red and blue lights flashed to life. "You've got to be kidding me," Amara muttered, checking her speedometer. She hadn't been speeding, and she knew for certain she'd stopped at the sign. With a sigh, she signaled and pulled over to the curb, positioning her car properly. Amara had been through this before. As a black woman driving an expensive car in an affluent neighborhood, she'd experienced her share of random stops. She turned down her music, rolled down her window, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. Officer James Miller watched the sedan pull over smoothly. He'd been working this beat for nearly 12 years, and he prided himself on keeping suspicious elements out of Pine Ridge. The car didn't look like it belonged to any of the residents he recognized, and he'd noticed the driver was a black woman. In his mind, that was reason enough for a check. He approached the driver's side window with a hand resting near his holster, a habit he displayed more often with certain drivers than others. His face was set in a stern expression as he leaned slightly to peer into the window. "License and registration," he said flatly, not bothering with a greeting or explaining why he'd pulled her over. Amara looked up at him calmly. "Good afternoon, officer. May I ask why I'm being stopped?" Officer Miller's expression hardened. "You rolled through that stop sign back there. License and registration, please." "I'm certain I came to a complete stop," Amara replied evenly. "But I'm happy to provide my documents. My license is in my purse on the passenger seat, and my registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for them now, if that's all right with you." The officer gave a curt nod, watching her every move with suspicion. Amara reached slowly for her purse, removed her wallet, and extracted her driver's license. Then, just as carefully, she opened the glove compartment and found her registration. As she handed the documents to Officer Miller, she couldn't help but notice how his eyes darted around the interior of her car, as if searching for something incriminating. "Is this address current?" he asked, tapping her license with his finger. "Yes, I just moved to Pine Ridge last week. I purchased the Harrison property on Maple Avenue." Officer Miller raised an eyebrow. "The Harrison place? That's quite a home." His tone suggested disbelief. "Yes, it is," Amara replied simply. "And what exactly brings you to this neighborhood?" he asked, emphasizing the word "you" in a way that made his meaning clear. Amara kept her expression neutral despite the familiar sting of the implication. "I recently accepted a new position in town." "What kind of position would that be?" The officer pressed, clearly overstepping the bounds of a routine traffic stop. "I work in law enforcement oversight," Amara answered truthfully but vaguely. Years of experience had taught her to save certain revelations for the right moment. Officer Miller's radio crackled, and a dispatcher's voice came through with a call about a disturbance across town. He ignored it, continuing to study Amara's license with unwarranted intensity. "Wait here," he finally said, turning to walk back to his patrol car. As soon as he was out of earshot, Amara let out a slow breath. She glanced at her watch. She was going to be late for her video call with her sister. She noticed Officer Miller's name tag and badge number, committing both to memory. Then she discreetly took out her phone and sent a quick text message to her new assistant. "Running late. Pulled over by Officer J. Miller, badge par 4873, Pine Ridge PD, no valid reason given. Will call when I'm free." Through her side mirror, Amara could see Officer Miller in his patrol car, speaking into his radio while typing on his computer. She knew he was running her information, checking for any violations or warrants, and finding none. She had a spotless driving record and had never been in trouble with the law. In fact, she'd spent her career upholding it. After several minutes, longer than a routine check should take, Officer Miller emerged from his cruiser and sauntered back to her window, his posture suggesting irritation, rather than the relief most officers would feel when dealing with a driver who had no record. "Do you know many people in Pine Ridge, Ms. Wilson?" he asked, deliberately dropping her professional title that had appeared on her license. "It's Dr. Wilson, actually," she corrected him politely. "And no, not yet. I'm still settling in." Officer Miller's eyes narrowed slightly at the correction. "Well, Dr. Wilson, Pine Ridge is a quiet community. We like to keep it that way. We keep a close eye on unfamiliar vehicles and new faces." The implication hung in the air between them. Amara had heard variations of this speech before in other towns from other officers. The message was always the same: "You don't belong here." "I understand," she said evenly. "Community safety is important to me too." Officer Miller handed back her license and registration along with a citation. "You've been issued a warning for running that stop sign. I suggest you pay closer attention to traffic laws in the future." Amara glanced at the paper, noting that despite calling it a warning, he'd actually written her a ticket with a $175 fine. She also noticed he'd marked the violation as failure to come to a complete stop, despite having no evidence to support this claim. "Officer Miller," she said, looking directly at him, "I know I came to a complete stop at that intersection. There were no other cars present and I followed the law precisely." His expression hardened. "Are you saying I'm lying, Dr. Wilson?" "Because I clearly saw what I saw." "I'm simply stating the facts as they occurred," Amara replied calmly. "Is there a camera at that intersection that might have recorded the event?" Officer Miller's jaw tightened. "You can contest the ticket in court if you want to waste your time. But let me give you some friendly advice. It's your word against a 12-year veteran of the force. Who do you think the judge will believe?" He leaned slightly closer to her window. "Things work a certain way here in Pine Ridge. The sooner you understand that, the easier your time will be." Amara accepted the ticket without further argument. "Thank you for explaining how things work, Officer Miller. I look forward to learning more about Pine Ridge and its systems." Something in her tone made Officer Miller pause, but he quickly dismissed whatever doubt had crept into his mind. "Drive safely now," he said with artificial politeness. "And remember, complete stops at every sign." As he walked away, Amara carefully folded the citation and placed it in her purse. She watched in her mirror as Officer Miller returned to his patrol car, but didn't immediately drive away. He was watching her, waiting to see what she would do next. Amara signaled, checked her mirrors, and pulled away from the curb, driving exactly at the speed limit. She continued down the street with perfect driving form, stopping completely at the next sign for several seconds longer than necessary. Only when she turned onto Maple Avenue did Officer Miller finally drive off in the opposite direction, apparently satisfied that she was indeed heading to the address on her license. Amara pulled into the driveway of her new home, a stately colonial with a freshly painted front door. She sat in her car for a moment, collecting herself and processing what had just happened. It wasn't the first time she'd experienced profiling, but the encounter reinforced exactly why she had accepted this particular position in this particular town. She took out her phone and called her assistant. "I'm home now." "Yes, everything's fine. Could you do me a favor? I need everything we have on Officer James Miller, badge number 4873. And please schedule a meeting with the chief for tomorrow morning. Tell him it's urgent." As she ended the call and stepped out of her car, Amara looked back in the direction Officer Miller had disappeared. In her 20-year career, she had learned that some lessons needed to be taught directly. And Officer Miller was about to receive an education he wouldn't forget. Tomorrow would be interesting, she thought as she walked toward her front door. Very interesting indeed. Officer James Miller arrived at the station the next morning in a foul mood. He'd slept poorly, troubled by strange dreams where traffic tickets turned into snakes in his hands. He nodded curtly to the desk sergeant and headed straight for the break room, desperate for coffee. "Hey Miller, rough night?" Officer Patel asked, sliding a fresh pot of coffee toward him. "Something like that," Miller grumbled, filling his mug to the brim. "Just one of those feelings, you know? Like something's off." "Well, heads up. Chief wants to see you at 9, Patel said, glancing at the wall clock. "Sounded important?" Miller checked his watch, 8:45. "Did he say what it's about?" "Nope. Just that you should bring your body cam footage from yesterday's shift." Miller frowned. The chief rarely reviewed routine footage unless there was a complaint. He mentally ran through yesterday's stops, landing on the woman in the Navy sedan. She'd been irritating with her calm correction about her title and that knowing look in her eyes. But he'd done nothing wrong. Just a standard stop for a traffic violation. After gulping down his coffee, Miller downloaded his body cam footage and headed toward the chief's office. The door was closed and Miller could see two figures through the frosted glass. The chief wasn't alone. He knocked twice. "Come in," the chief called out. Miller entered to find Chief Thompson sitting behind his desk looking unusually tense. Across from him sat the woman from yesterday's traffic stop. Dr. Amara Wilson. Miller's step faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. "Standing at attention. Officer Miller," the chief said formally, "I believe you've already met Dr. Wilson." "Yes, sir," Miller replied stiffly, avoiding eye contact with Amara. "During a routine traffic stop yesterday." "Good morning, Officer Miller," Amara said pleasantly, as if they were meeting for the first time at a community picnic rather than in the chief's office after an unpleasant encounter. "Dr. Wilson has joined our department in a rather significant capacity," the chief continued, his voice carefully neutral. "She's our new head of internal affairs." The words hit Miller like a bucket of ice water. He felt his face grow hot, then cold. The head of internal affairs. The person responsible for investigating officer misconduct. And he'd pulled her over on her way home, treating her like she didn't belong in her own neighborhood. "I see," Miller managed to say, his throat suddenly dry. "Please have a seat." "Officer?" Amara gestured to the empty chair beside her. "We have some things to discuss." Miller sat down rigidly, his back not touching the chair. His mind raced through yesterday's interaction, desperately trying to remember if he'd said anything explicitly discriminatory. He hadn't used any slurs, at least. But his tone, his questions about what she was doing in that neighborhood. Chief Thompson cleared his throat. "Dr. Wilson has raised some concerns about your conduct during yesterday's traffic stop." "With all due respect." "Sir?" Miller began, the familiar defensive words springing to his lips. "I was simply doing my job. Dr. Wilson ran a stop sign, and I issued a citation as per department policy." Amara smiled slightly. "That's what we're here to verify, Officer Miller. I've requested the footage from your body cam as well as the dashboard camera. I believe they'll help clarify what actually happened." The chief nodded to his computer screen. "I was just about to review the footage when you arrived." Excellent timing. Miller felt sweat forming on his back as the chief turned the screen so they could all see it. The video began playing, showing Miller's approach to Amara's car. His hand near his holster, his curt demand for license and registration without explaining the reason for the stop until she asked. The audio picked up every word of their exchange, including his pointed questions about what she was doing in that neighborhood and his deliberate use of Ms. instead of Doctor, despite seeing her credentials. But worse, the dashboard camera clearly showed the intersection from moments before, with Amara's car coming to a complete and proper stop before proceeding. There was no traffic violation. The footage didn't lie. Miller stared at the screen, his mind scrambling for explanations. The angle must be from where I was positioned. It appeared." "Officer Miller," Amara interrupted gently, "I think we both know what happened here." The chief stopped the playback and turned to Miller with a grave expression. "This is serious, Miller. You issued a false citation and conducted a stop without probable cause." "It was an honest mistake," Miller insisted, though the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Was it?" Amara asked, opening a folder she'd brought with her. "Because I took the liberty of reviewing your record, Officer Miller. In the past year alone, you've pulled over 67 black and brown drivers in Pine Ridge, compared to only 12 white drivers. That's quite a disparity considering the demographics of the area." Miller felt the blood drain from his face. He'd never seen the numbers laid out so starkly before. "Additionally," she continued, "complaints have been filed against you for unprofessional conduct during traffic stops, though interestingly, none have resulted in disciplinary action." She glanced at the chief, who had the good grace to look uncomfortable. "Look," Miller said, his voice tight, "Pine Ridge has certain standards. I've been keeping this community safe for 12 years. "Safe from whom exactly?" Amara asked, her voice still calm but with an edge of steel beneath it. The question hung in the air between them. Miller had no answer that wouldn't dig him deeper into trouble. Chief Thompson sighed heavily. "Officer Miller, at minimum this incident represents a violation of department policy regarding proper procedure for traffic stops. At worst, it suggests a pattern of biased policing that could expose this department to serious liability." "What happens now?" Miller asked, his voice barely audible. Amara closed her folder and looked directly at him. That depends partly on you, Officer Miller. Meaning? I could file a formal complaint, push for disciplinary action, possibly even termination given your record, she said matter-of-factly. But that's not why I took this position. She leaned forward slightly. I'm here to change the culture of policing in this town, not just punish individual officers. I believe in rehabilitation when possible, in giving people the chance to recognize their biases and grow beyond them. Miller looked at her with suspicion. So what are you suggesting? I'm implementing a new training program, she explained. It addresses implicit bias, de-escalation techniques, and community-centered policing. I'd like you to be part of the first group. You want me to be your guinea pig, Miller said flatly. I want you to be an example, Amara corrected him, of both the problem and hopefully the solution. Chief Thompson cleared his throat. Dr. Wilson has been very reasonable in her approach, Miller. She could have walked in here demanding your badge, and based on this evidence, I'd have had little choice but to consider it. Miller looked between them, feeling trapped. And if I refuse? Then we proceed with a formal investigation into your conduct, Amara said simply. And given what I've already uncovered, I don't think that would end well for you. Miller sat in silence for a long moment. Everything in him wanted to fight back, to defend himself, to insist he'd done nothing wrong. But the evidence was right there on the screen. The complete stop, the questions about what she was doing in that neighborhood, the statistics on his traffic stops. For the first time, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was some truth to what she was saying. How long is this training program? He finally asked. 6 weeks, Amara replied. 3 hours twice a week plus some field work with community organizations? Miller nodded slowly. And my regular duties? You'll be on desk duty for the duration, the chief interjected. Consider it a temporary reassignment. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than losing his job entirely. And something about the way Dr. Wilson looked at him, not with hatred or vengeance, but with a steady determination to see change, made him think twice about fighting this. Fine, he said at last. I'll do your program. Amara nodded, satisfaction rather than triumph in her expression. The first session is tomorrow morning at 8. Don't be late. As Miller stood to leave, Amara added, Oh, and Officer Miller, I voided that citation you issued me. I trust that won't happen again. No, ma'am, Miller replied automatically, then corrected himself. Dr. Wilson. As he left the chief's office, Miller felt as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet. For 12 years, he'd believed he was simply doing his job, keeping Pine Ridge safe. Now, for the first time, he was being forced to consider that his definition of safe might have been shaped by biases he'd never acknowledged. He walked back to his desk with heavy steps, ignoring the curious glances from his fellow officers. They'd find out soon enough what had happened. News traveled fast in a small department. Miller sat down and stared at his computer screen, the image of Amara's car coming to a complete stop playing over and over in his mind. He had been so certain she'd rolled through it, so ready to believe she'd broken the law. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out his citation book, flipping through the recent tickets he'd issued. Names and faces flashed through his memory as he reviewed them. For the first time in his career, Officer James Miller began to wonder if he had been the problem all along. Officer Miller arrived at the community center 15 minutes early for the first training session, partly from habit and partly from anxiety. The room was empty except for a young man setting up chairs in a circle, a format Miller immediately disliked. Circle arrangements meant sharing feelings, and feelings weren't his strong suit. Morning, the young man said cheerfully. You must be Officer Miller. I'm Terrell, Dr. Wilson's assistant. Miller nodded stiffly. Is she here yet? On her way. Coffee's in the back if you want some. Miller helped himself to coffee in a paper cup and chose a seat facing the door. Old habits. Always know who's coming and going. Gradually, other officers filtered in. Miller recognized most of them. Officer Patel from the night shift, Rodriguez from traffic division, Chen from community outreach, and a few others. No one spoke much as they found their seats. The atmosphere was tense, like detention for grown-ups. At exactly 8 o'clock, Dr. Wilson walked in carrying a stack of folders. She wore a simple blouse and slacks, professional but approachable. Miller noted how different she looked from their first encounter when he'd pulled her over. Good morning, everyone, she said, setting her materials on a small table. Thank you for being here. A few officers mumbled responses. Miller remained silent, studying his coffee cup. "Before we begin, I want to be clear about something," Amara continued. "You're not here because I think you're bad officers or bad people. You're here because policing is one of the most challenging jobs in our society, and few of us receive adequate training on the psychological aspects of the work." She made eye contact with each person in the circle. When she reached Miller, he met her gaze briefly before looking away. "Today we're going to talk about implicit bias, not as an accusation but as a reality of human psychology that affects everyone in this room, myself included." Miller shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He'd expected a lecture about racism, not this calm, almost clinical approach. "Let's start with an exercise," Amara said, handing out papers face down. "Don't turn these over until I say so. When you do, you'll have 30 seconds to memorize as many details as possible." When everyone had a paper, she nodded. "Begin." Miller flipped his paper over to find a photograph of a crowded street scene. He scanned it quickly, taking in as many details as possible. People walking, storefronts, a dog on a leash. "Time's up," Amara called after 30 seconds. "Turn the papers face down again." She then handed out blank sheets. "Now write down everything you remember seeing in the photograph. Be as specific as possible." "You have 2 minutes," Miller wrote rapidly, listing everything he could recall. A man in a red jacket, a woman with shopping bags, a coffee shop on the corner, a bicycle chained to a lamppost. When the time was up, Amara collected their papers. "While I review these, I'd like you to discuss what you found easiest to remember and what was most difficult." The officers began talking hesitantly at first, then with more animation. Miller remained quiet until Officer Patel turned to him. "What about you, Miller? What stood out to you?" Miller shrugged. "The potential threats. The guy with his hand in his pocket near the ATM. The teenager with the backpack standing near the alley." A silence fell over the group. Neither of those details had stood out to the others. Amara looked up from the papers with interest. "That's exactly what I wanted to talk about. We all notice different things based on our experiences, training, and yes, our biases." She held up their responses. Every person in this room saw the same photograph but remembered different details. Officer Chen noted the elderly couple holding hands. Officer Rodriguez remembered the sale signs in the shop windows. Officer Miller focused on potential security threats. She set the papers down. "None of you are wrong. But what you noticed first, what your brain prioritized, tells us something about how you see the world." Miller frowned. "So because I noticed possible threats, I'm biased?" "No," Amara replied calmly. "You notice those things because you're trained to identify threats. That's valuable in police work. The problem comes when we only see threats in certain types of people or situations, and miss them in others." She projected a new image on the wall, statistics showing arrest rates by race in Pine Ridge compared to the actual demographics of the town. The data shows that Black residents of Pine Ridge are 4 times more likely to be stopped and searched than white residents, despite similar rates of contraband being found. This suggests that officers are perceiving threat more readily in Black residents. Miller wanted to argue but found himself thinking about his own traffic stops. The dashboard camera footage showing Amara's car coming to a complete stop played in his mind again. "For our next exercise," Amara continued, "I'd like you to pair up. You'll take turns telling each other about a time when you were unfairly judged." Miller was paired with Officer Chen, a quiet woman who'd been on the force for just under 5 years. She went first, describing how people often assumed she couldn't speak English well because of her appearance, despite being born and raised in Pine Ridge. When it was Miller's turn, he struggled. "I don't know if I've experienced that," he said awkwardly. Chen waited patiently. Miller thought back to his childhood. "Maybe when I was a kid," he finally said. "My dad left when I was 8, and teachers would always look at me different after that. Like they expected me to cause trouble because I didn't have a father. One teacher even said I'd probably end up in jail someday." The words came out more bitterly than he'd intended. He hadn't thought about that teacher in years. "That must have been hard," Chen said simply. "Yeah, well," Miller shrugged. "I proved her wrong, didn't I? Became a cop instead." When the pair shared with the larger group, Miller was surprised by the stories he heard. Officer Rodriguez talked about being followed in stores. Officer Patel described being randomly selected for additional screening at airports nearly every time he flew. When it was Miller's turn to share, he repeated his story briefly. uncomfortable with the attention, but Amara's response caught him off guard. "Thank you for sharing that, Officer Miller. Being prejudged based on family circumstances is something many people experience. It gives us a window into understanding how harmful assumptions can be." For the first time, Miller felt like she was seeing him as a person, not just a problem to fix. The rest of the session included discussions about brain science, how the amygdala processes potential threats, how stereotypes form as mental shortcuts, and how stress and fatigue can make people more likely to rely on those shortcuts. By the time the 3 hours ended, Miller was mentally exhausted but strangely unsettled. He'd expected to be defensive the entire time, but instead found himself thinking about things in ways he never had before. As everyone filed out, Amara called to him. "Officer Miller, do you have a moment?" He hung back, wondering if he'd done something wrong. "I wanted to thank you for your participation today," she said. "I know this isn't easy," Miller nodded stiffly. "Just doing what I was told." "I noticed something interesting in your responses," she continued, ignoring his tone. "You have excellent observational skills. Your description of the photograph was the most detailed of anyone's." Miller blinked, surprised by the compliment. "Thanks. Those skills are valuable," she said. "Good policing needs people who notice details. What I'm hoping is that through this program, you might apply those skills more equitably." Miller didn't know how to respond to that. Part of him wanted to dismiss everything from the session as politically correct nonsense. But another part, a part he wasn't entirely comfortable with, was still thinking about those statistics she'd shown. About the camera footage that had contradicted his perception so clearly. "Same time Thursday?" he finally asked. Amara nodded. "And Officer Miller? For Thursday's session, I'd like you to spend some time in the Pine Ridge Community Garden tomorrow. Just an hour or so in plain clothes. Observe, maybe chat with people if the opportunity arises. The assignment is simply to notice things without the filter of your uniform. The garden on Elm Street? That's not even in my patrol area." "Exactly," she said with a small smile. "Fresh perspectives require new territory." As Miller walked to his car, he felt oddly off balance, as if the ground had shifted beneath him again. He'd expected to hate every minute of the training, to mentally check out and just go through the motions. Instead, he found himself wondering what he might see at the community garden tomorrow, and why Dr. Wilson had chosen that particular location. For the first time in years, Officer James Miller was curious rather than certain, and that, though he didn't know it yet, was precisely the point. The Pine Ridge Community Garden wasn't what Miller had expected. Instead of a few sad tomato plants and some struggling flowers, he found a thriving green space that took up nearly half a block. Raised beds overflowed with vegetables, fruit trees lined the borders, and a small greenhouse gleamed in the afternoon sun. Miller parked his personal car across the street and sat for a moment, feeling oddly nervous. In plain clothes, jeans and a faded blue t-shirt, he looked like any other visitor, but he felt exposed without his uniform and badge. They were more than just clothes. They were armor, identity. He finally got out and wandered into the garden, hands in his pockets, trying to look casual. A few people worked among the plants. An elderly man watering seedlings, a woman with gray-streaked hair harvesting something leafy, 2 teenagers building what looked like a birdhouse. No one paid him much attention as he walked along the stone path that wound through the garden. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to be doing. "Just observe," Dr. Wilson had said. "But observe what exactly? First time here?" a voice asked. Miller turned to find a man about his age smiling at him. He wore dirt-stained work gloves and carried a basket of bell peppers. "That obvious, huh?" Miller replied. "You've got that. Where am I supposed to go look?" The man extended his hand. "I'm David, garden coordinator." "James," Miller said, using his first name instead of the Officer Miller he was used to giving. "Just, checking the place out." "Feel free to wander around," David said. "We're open to everyone. If you're interested in a plot of your own, there's a waiting list, but we also have community beds that anyone can help with." Miller nodded, then gestured to the basket. "Quite a harvest." "These are for the food pantry," David explained. "We donate about 60% of what we grow. The rest goes to the gardeners." As they talked, Miller noticed a group of children arriving, accompanied by a woman who greeted David warmly. "Youth program," David explained, following Miller's gaze. "Kids from the East Side apartments come twice a week. Most of them don't have yards, so this is their only chance to dig in the dirt and grow things. The east side. Miller knew it well, the part of town with the highest crime rates where he'd made many of his arrests over the years. He watched as the children scattered eagerly through the garden, each heading to what was clearly their own small plot. They seem to know what they're doing, Miller commented, surprised by their focus. Third year for most of them, David said proudly. Some of these kids could teach agriculture classes by now. A girl of about 10 approached David, tugging at his sleeve. "Mr. David, something's wrong with my tomatoes. The leaves are all spotty." "Let's take a look, Zoe," David said, then turned to Miller. "Want to come along? You might learn something." Miller followed them to a small plot where a worried-looking tomato plant drooped with yellowing, spotted leaves. David said, bending down. "Looks like early blight. Not the end of the world." He explained to Zoe how to treat the plant, showing her which leaves to remove and how to make a simple treatment from baking soda and water. The girl listened intently, asking questions that showed she knew more about gardening than Miller had expected. "You'll want to spray the other plants too, as prevention," David told her. "Think you can handle that?" "Yes, sir," she said confidently. "I'm not losing my tomatoes after all this work." As she hurried off to get supplies, David turned to Miller. "You look surprised," Miller shrugged. "I guess I am. These kids are from the East Side apartments?" "Every single one," David confirmed. "Does that change something?" Miller felt a flush of embarrassment. "No, in my line of work, I usually see a different side of that neighborhood." "You're a cop," David said. It wasn't a question. Miller tensed. "How'd you know?" David laughed. "The way you stand. The way you scanned the whole garden when you arrived, noting all the exit points. The way you keep your right hand free even though you're not carrying anything right now." "You're observant," Miller said, impressed despite himself. "Former military," David explained. "Old habits." They walked together through the garden, David pointing out different projects. The herb spiral built by a community college class. The butterfly garden maintained by a group of seniors from the local retirement home. The special accessible beds designed for gardeners with mobility issues. "So what brings a cop to our garden? Out of uniform?" David asked casually as they walked. Miller hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Part of a training program. I'm supposed to observe." "Ah," David nodded knowingly. "You're one of Dr. Wilson's projects." Miller stopped walking. "You know Dr. Wilson. She helped us get funding for the youth program last year, before she took the internal affairs position. Brilliant woman. Terrifying when she needs to be." "You can say that again," Miller muttered. David laughed. "Let me guess. You got on her bad side somehow and now you're doing penance by visiting community gardens?" Miller found himself smiling reluctantly. "Something like that." They reached a shaded area with benches where a few people sat chatting. An elderly black woman waved at David. "Come meet Ms. Loretta," David said. "She's the heart and soul of this place." Ms. Loretta turned out to be 87 years old, a resident of Pine Ridge for over 60 years, and a font of knowledge about both gardening and town history. She insisted Miller sit while she told him about how the garden had transformed from an abandoned lot where drug deals once took place to the vibrant space it was now. "We didn't wait for permission," she said with a gleam in her eye. "Just started clearing trash one day. City officials tried to stop us at first, said we didn't have permits. But we kept going. Eventually they gave up and gave in." As she spoke, Miller realized he'd driven past this lot hundreds of times over the years, first noting it as a trouble spot, then eventually not noticing it at all as it transformed. He'd never bothered to stop and see what had replaced the empty lot he'd once watched for criminal activity. "You should bring your family next time," Ms. Loretta told him. "We have community dinners every Friday. Everyone brings something to share." "I'm not much of a cook," Miller admitted. "You can bring store-bought," she said with a wink. "We only judge a little." Miller found himself laughing, surprising himself with how at ease he felt. When was the last time he'd had a conversation with a civilian that wasn't part of an investigation or traffic stop? As the afternoon wore on, Miller met more gardeners, a doctor who grew medicinal herbs, a high school teacher who brought his biology students for hands-on lessons, a young mother who had learned to garden from YouTube videos and now supplied her family with fresh vegetables year-round. Before he knew it, 2 hours had passed. He'd meant to stay for only the minimum hour Dr. Wilson had requested. As he prepared to leave, David handed him a paper bag. Some cherry tomatoes and basil. First-time visitor gift. Miller accepted the bag awkwardly. Thanks. I appreciate it. Come back any time, David said. Hands are always welcome. No experience necessary. Driving home, Miller found himself replaying conversations from the garden. No one there had known he was a police officer except David. And even after finding out, David had treated him like any other visitor. No tension, no wariness. Was that how people interacted when they didn't see him as Officer Miller, just as James? The next training session with Dr. Wilson was even more uncomfortable than the first, but for different reasons. Miller found himself noticing things he'd never paid attention to before. How Officer Rodriguez straightened his posture whenever his professionalism was questioned. How Officer Chen had developed a habit of over-explaining her reasoning for every decision. Were these defensive adaptations to biased treatment? A month ago, Miller would have dismissed the idea. Now he wasn't so sure. When Dr. Wilson asked about their community assignments, Miller described the garden without mentioning his conversation with David about her. He talked about Miss Loretta and the children from the East Side apartments, surprised by how animated he became. And what did you take away from the experience? Dr. Wilson asked. Miller thought carefully before answering. I've driven past that lot probably 1,000 times on patrol. I saw it change over the years but never bothered to find out how or why. I just categorized it, first as a problem area, then as a non-problem area. I never saw it as a community achievement. Dr. Wilson nodded. That's a valuable insight, Officer Miller. Sometimes the biggest blind spots in policing aren't about who we see as threats, but about what we fail to see at all. For once, Miller didn't bristle at her assessment, because for once he was beginning to think she might be right. 6 months had passed since Officer Miller's first training session with Dr. Wilson. The program had officially ended 4 months ago, but its effects continued to ripple through the Pine Ridge Police Department. Miller stood in front of a fresh batch of Police Academy graduates, 20 young faces looking up at him with a mixture of eagerness and uncertainty. As the department's newly appointed field training coordinator, it was his job to guide these rookies through their first real experiences on the job. Being a good cop isn't just about knowing the law or being physically fit, he told them. It's about seeing clearly. And I don't just mean spotting a suspect in a crowd or reading body language. I mean really seeing the community you serve. All of it. Not just the parts that fit your expectations. He paced slowly in front of them, more at ease as a teacher than he ever would have imagined 6 months ago. Let me tell you a story, he continued. About 6 months ago, I pulled over a woman for running a stop sign. Except she didn't run it. My dashcam later proved she came to a complete stop. But I was so certain she had broken the law that I saw what I expected to see, not what was actually there. A few of the rookies exchanged glances, surprised by this admission from a senior officer. Why did I expect her to break the law? Because she was black, driving an expensive car in a predominantly white neighborhood. I didn't consciously think that, but my actions revealed it. Miller let that sink in for a moment before continuing. That woman turned out to be Dr. Amara Wilson, our head of internal affairs. And instead of firing me on the spot, which she had every right to do, she put me through a training program that changed how I see everything. From the back of the room, a voice said, "And now you're passing that wisdom on to the next generation." Miller turned to see Dr. Wilson standing in the doorway, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Rookies," Miller said, "this is Dr. Wilson. She'll be co-leading today's session on community-based policing." As Amara walked to the front of the room, Miller noted how different their relationship was now compared to their first encounters. There was respect between them, and a shared mission that had emerged gradually over the months. "Officer Miller is being modest," Amara told the rookies. "He's become one of our department's most valuable assets in rebuilding trust with communities that have historically had tense relationships with law enforcement." Miller felt a flush of pride at her words. It had been a long road from that traffic stop to here, with plenty of uncomfortable moments along the way. After the training session ended, Miller and Amara walked together toward the parking lot. "The community satisfaction surveys came in this morning," Amara said. "Overall approval of the police department is up 12% from last year." "That's good news," Miller replied. "Any specific areas of improvement?" East Side residents reported feeling safer during police interactions. And there's been a 30% drop in complaints about officer conduct during traffic stops. Miller nodded, thinking about how many of those previous complaints might have involved him. The garden program is going well too, he added. 4 officers are now volunteering regularly, and we've got a waiting list of others who want to join once we expand. The community garden project had been Miller's idea, a way to get officers involved in the community in non-enforcement roles. Officers volunteered during off hours, working alongside residents to maintain the garden and build relationships outside the context of law enforcement. David mentioned you built that irrigation system. For the new beds, Amara said. Just something I threw together. Miller said modestly. My grandfather was a plumber. Picked up a few things. They reached the parking lot and paused by Amara's car, the same Navy sedan he had pulled over half a year ago. Chief Thompson is retiring next month, Amara said. Changing the subject, the mayor asked for my input on potential replacements. Miller raised an eyebrow. Anyone in mind? Lieutenant Rivera would be solid. She has the experience and the right mindset for where we're trying to go as a department. Miller nodded in agreement. She'd be good. Progressive but practical. The mayor also asked about you, Amara added casually. Miller laughed, then realized she was serious. Me, for chief? I'm not even a lieutenant. Field promotions happen, especially for officers who demonstrate exceptional leadership qualities and the ability to drive cultural change. Miller leaned against a nearby car, processing this unexpected information. I don't know, Dr. Wilson. 6 months ago I was the problem, not the solution. And that's exactly why you might be the right person, she replied. You understand both sides. You've experienced the transformation we're trying to create throughout the department. Miller shook his head. I still have a lot to learn. We all do, Amara said. That's the point. The difference is that now you know it. Later that afternoon, Miller sat in his patrol car outside Pine Ridge Elementary School, watching as children streamed out the doors at the end of the day. It was a routine assignment. Monitor the school zone, make sure traffic flowed smoothly, keep an eye out for anything unusual. But Miller approached it differently now. Instead of scanning only for threats, he noticed the positive things too. The crossing guard who knew every child's name, the older students helping younger ones find their buses, the parent volunteers directing the pickup line with cheerful efficiency. His radio crackled with a call about a suspicious person near the community center. As Miller acknowledged the call and pulled away from the school, he found himself thinking about how he would have responded 6 months ago versus now. Before, suspicious person would have automatically triggered his threat response. He would have arrived ready for confrontation, hand near his weapon, authority in his voice. Now he resolved to arrive with open eyes and an open mind. To observe before concluding, to engage before enforcing. As he pulled up to the community center, he saw a man pacing near the entrance looking agitated. In the past, Miller would have immediately ordered him to stop and put his hands where they could be seen. Instead, Miller approached calmly, noting the man's body language, anxious but not aggressive. Afternoon. Sir, he said in a conversational tone, everything okay? The man turned, relief washing over his face at the sight of a police officer. Officer, thank goodness. My daughter's inside at her dance class, but my car just died in the parking lot. I've got my son's insulin in the car and it needs refrigeration. I was trying to find someone with a cooler. Miller nodded. Let me help you with that. We've got a cooler in my patrol car we can use temporarily. Then we'll figure out what's wrong with your vehicle. 20 minutes later, the insulin was safely stored, and Miller had helped the man jumpstart his car, which had a dying battery. As the man thanked him profusely, Miller handed him a card. If you're still having car trouble, my brother-in-law runs a fair repair shop in town. Tell him James sent you. Driving away, Miller reflected on how differently this encounter would have gone in his previous mindset. A suspicious person report would have been handled as a potential threat, not a person in need. And both he and the father would have had a much worse day as a result. At the end of his shift, Miller found himself driving past Dr. Wilson's house, the Harrison place on Maple Avenue. The house where this whole journey had begun when he'd pulled her over 6 months ago. On impulse, he pulled over and sent her a text. Just wanted to say thanks for not giving up on me. Her reply came quickly. The best officers aren't the ones who never make mistakes. They're the ones who learn from them. Miller smiled as he put his phone away and pulled back onto the road. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to get it right or get it wrong. But for the first time in his career, he wasn't afraid of making mistakes, because he'd learned that acknowledging them was the first step toward real change, both in himself and in the community he'd sworn to protect and serve. As he drove through the streets of Pine Ridge, Officer James Miller saw the town with new eyes. Not perfect eyes, but clearer ones, and that, he had learned, made all the difference.